Here's a number that should bother you. In most wars before the 20th century, more soldiers died from disease than from actual combat. Not a little more, sometimes 5 or 6 times more. An army could win every battle it fought and still lose because of what happened after the fighting stopped. Thousands of bodies, no time, no equipment, and no plan for what to do with them. This video is about that problem. What actually happens when an ancient or medieval army suddenly has more dead than it can bury, and what that rotting, uncollected death did to everyone left alive nearby? Let's start with the basic math, because it's worse than people assume. A single medieval battle could produce anywhere from a few thousand to tens of thousands of bodies in a single afternoon. The Battle of Towton in 1461, fought in England during the Wars of the Roses, is estimated to have killed around 28,000 men in a single day, in a snowstorm, on a battlefield roughly the size of a few farms. Now here's the part battle reenactment shows never cover. An army of that era typically had no dedicated burial corps, no graves registration unit, no refrigerated storage, no body bags. You had winners who wanted to leave the area as fast as possible, because staying near a battlefield meant staying near an enemy who might regroup. And you had local villagers who suddenly had thousands of corpses appear in their fields overnight, with zero say in the matter. Mass grave archaeology at Towton actually found the evidence directly. Skeletons dumped in irregular pits, stacked without coffins, without ceremony, often with skulls showing catastrophic blunt and blade trauma that tells you exactly how brutal and fast this had to happen. These weren't respectful burials, they were disposal, done as quickly as physically possible, because leaving bodies exposed was even worse than the alternative. And the reason it was worse is the entire subject of this video, because an unburied body doesn't just sit there quietly being sad. It becomes a weapon nobody fired on purpose. Let's be specific, because vague horror is less useful than understanding the actual mechanism. Within days in warm weather, sometimes hours, decomposition attracts insects, contaminates any nearby water source, and creates conditions for bacterial growth that has nothing to do with the original cause of death. A battlefield with 3,000 exposed bodies isn't just a grim sight. It's an active, spreading public health emergency for every village within walking distance. Medieval and ancient chroniclers didn't have germ theory, but they absolutely understood the pattern, even if their explanation was wrong. They called it miasma, bad air, a poisonous vapor rising off rotting matter that was believed to directly cause illness in anyone who breathed it. We now know it wasn't the smell itself doing the damage, it was contaminated water, biting insects, and direct contact with infectious material. But the miasma theory got one thing exactly right by accident. Proximity to mass death reliably made people sick. They just had the mechanism wrong, not the correlation. This is why so many historical accounts describe armies retreating from their own victories, not because they lost, but because staying camped next to their own unburied dead and their enemies' unburied dead started killing more of them than the battle had. And nowhere does this play out more disastrously than in a siege. Because unlike an open battlefield, nobody can just leave. A siege is, structurally, the worst possible environment for this problem. You have a large concentration of people, soldiers and civilians both, trapped inside walls for weeks or months, with sanitation systems never designed for wartime population density and casualties that have nowhere to go. The Black Death's most infamous military connection comes from exactly this setup. The 1346 Siege of Caffa, a Genoese trading post on the Black Sea, besieged by a Mongol army under Johnny Beg. According to the one surviving contemporary account, the besieging Mongol force was being devastated by plague, and, whether out of desperation, revenge, or grim practicality, they began catapulting their own plague dead over the city walls into Caffa itself. Historians still debate how much this single act actually caused the plague spread into Europe versus simply accelerating something already in motion via trade routes, but the strategic logic is documented and chilling either way. Infected bodies were being deliberately weaponized as a tool of siege warfare, 700 years before anyone understood what a pathogen was. This may be one of the earliest documented uses of biological warfare in human history, and it happened entirely by people who didn't know what disease actually was. They just knew that being near the dead of a stricken army made you sick, so they aimed that fact at their enemy. Caffa's surviving traders reportedly fled by ship back toward Italy, and several accounts link those very ships to the Black Death's arrival in Sicily in 1347. A single siege, a single tactic born from a mass casualty crisis nobody could manage, and a plague that would go on to kill an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population. But you didn't need a deliberate biological weapon for this to spiral out of control. Ordinary camp conditions were more than enough on their own.
Camp fever is the historical term for what we'd now recognize as typhus, and it thrived in exactly the conditions every pre-modern army created without even trying. Overcrowded tents, minimal sanitation, contaminated water, and lice. The actual vector, though nobody knew that until the 20th century. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 is one of history's most devastating illustrations of this. Of the roughly 600,000 troops that crossed into Russia, historians estimate that disease, typhus especially, killed far more soldiers than actual combat with Russian forces did. The retreat through brutal Russian winter, alongside collapsing sanitation and a starving, exhausted army marching past its own dead and dying, turned a military campaign into a rolling epidemiological catastrophe. Some estimates suggest typhus alone may have killed more of Napoleon's army than every battle of the campaign combined. This pattern repeats across nearly every major pre-modern war you can name. The 30 Years' War in the 1600s devastated huge portions of Central Europe's population, and a large share of those deaths came not from soldiers killing each other, but from disease and famine spreading through displaced populations, overcrowded garrisons, and armies that dragged epidemic conditions with them like a second army nobody enlisted. Even into the American Civil War, still well after real medical advances had begun, roughly twice as many soldiers are estimated to have died from disease as from combat wounds. Camps with poor sanitation, contaminated water, and again, no working germ theory to guide prevention. So if unburied bodies and overcrowded camps were this dangerous, what did anyone actually do to manage it? Because doing nothing clearly wasn't sustainable. The methods varied enormously depending on culture, era, and how much time an army realistically had. Mass trench burial was the most common baseline solution. Dig one long pit, rather than individual graves, and place bodies in with minimal ceremony, sometimes in layers. It wasn't disrespectful by the standards of the time, it was a triage decision. Archaeological digs at sites like the mass grave at Visby in Sweden from a 1361 battle show exactly this. Hundreds of bodies, many still in their armor because there wasn't time or manpower to strip and individually process them, buried together in trenches shortly after the battle. Lime was another widely used tool, though its actual function was often misunderstood at the time. Quicklime was spread over mass graves in the belief that it would accelerate decomposition and purify the site. In reality, lime's effect on decomposition rate is more complicated than people assumed, but its drying and odor masking properties made it a psychologically reassuring tool even where its practical benefit was overstated. What it definitely did was make mass grave sites more bearable to work near, which mattered enormously for morale among the burial parties themselves. Cremation, where fuel and time allowed, was another option, particularly favored in cultures and periods where burning the dead was already religiously or culturally normal, rather than something reserved only for crisis. It solved the contagion problem quickly and effectively, at the cost of requiring significant firewood, which not every battlefield location could supply on short notice. And in the very worst cases, full-blown plague outbreaks in cities rather than battlefields, dedicated plague pits became common across medieval and early modern Europe.
London alone has multiple documented and archaeologically confirmed plague pits from the Black Death and later outbreaks. Mass burial sites created specifically because the normal churchyard burial system, one grave and one ceremony at a time, physically could not process the volume of dead fast enough to keep pace with the epidemic. All of which raises the obvious question: how much of this actually changed once people understood what disease was?
The real shift didn't come from better burial methods.
It came from germ theory itself, developed properly in the mid to late 1800s through the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Once armies and governments understood that specific microorganisms, not bad air, cause disease, military medicine started actually targeting the real mechanism: clean water supply, sanitation discipline in camps, vaccination, and, eventually, antibiotics. World War I is often cited as the first major conflict where advances in medicine and sanitation meaningfully closed the gap between combat deaths and disease deaths. Though disease, especially the 1918 influenza pandemic that spread explosively through crowded troop transports and camps, still killed staggering numbers of people worldwide. A reminder that even with modern medical knowledge, mass casualty conditions remain a uniquely dangerous multiplier for disease. It's worth sitting with how recent this understanding actually is. For the overwhelming majority of military history, thousands of years of warfare across every continent, nobody fighting these wars had any accurate idea why standing near the dead made people sick. They knew it happened. They built entire burial practices, superstitions, and battlefield tactics around the fact that it happened. They just never knew why until a shockingly short time ago.
Here's the thing that should really sit with you. Warfare has never really been decided purely by who has the better army. For most of human history, it's been decided just as much by whichever side's death toll spiraled into a disease outbreak first. Entire campaigns, entire empires' military fortunes, quietly turned on sanitation and burial logistics far more often than on tactical genius or heroism, and almost none of that makes it into how war gets remembered or taught. We tell history through battles and generals and decisive tactical maneuvers. But for an enormous share of pre-modern military history, the deciding factor was closer to whoever's camp had cleaner water and whoever buried their dead a few days faster. So the next time you hear about some legendary ancient battle, remember, the fighting itself might have lasted a single afternoon. What happened in the weeks after, the mass graves, the lime pits, the camp fever spreading through the survivors, that's often the part that actually decided who was left standing. If this kind of history is what you come here for, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what era or topic you want covered next.
Make sure to subscribe for more epic content. And click that bell icon too.